Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to talk really loud, like the whole time, and if the mic will probably be fine, but who knows? We'll figure it out. I'm Tim Pucco. I'm the climate correspondent at the Washington Post. I just want to thank you all for joining us today. Our panel is called "Bridging the Divide: Making Action on the Energy Transition a Reality." We're very excited. We have some great panelists. We're going to be webcasting this live. And the full video will also be available in days to come. So for those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And right now, I just want to introduce all of you. I think we all know one another, so I don't know what I'm talking about. You might encounter this. I don't know how often I'm going to know what I'm talking about, but we're going to get through this together. and so first of all, I want to introduce you to Jason Bordoff. Jason is the founding director here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and he's the one who brought us all together today. And next to him, we have Abigail Dillon, who's the president of Earth Justice, a top environmental law firm. And then we have Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change for the Canadian government. And next to him is Catherine Hayhoe. She is the director, the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. So we're going to be going through a lot of questions today. We're going to have questions for you, time for you to ask questions, maybe in the last 10 or 15 minutes too. But right now, I just want to turn to Jason just to get us started. You wrote a column recently about what we've seen from the oil industry and its action on climate change, or maybe its retrenchment on some of that action over the past year. I'll just kind of ask you broadly, to kind of describe that, summarize that, and especially, did you have a bit of an epiphany at all over the past year as we've seen a bit of a change in tactics from the oil industry?
I don't know if it wasn't an epiphany. I was just sort of commenting on what we've been seeing in the last year plus. If we're going to make this transition happen at anywhere close to the scale and speed we need, it's a Herculean task. We need all hands on deck. The potential for capital budgets and engineering expertise that some of the biggest companies have for solutions that we will need, like carbon capture or others, as well as dramatic expansion in EVs and renewables, is real. And notwithstanding that, what we are seeing is that the industry as a whole, and that is painting with a broad brush, but let's say the industry as a whole is spending a few percentage points of CapEx at a time of very high record profits on clean energy in an environment that has renewed concerns about energy security and energy prices, costs of clean energy after years of decline, actually starting to reverse, like offshore wind in some cases. It's important to remember when we talk about the industry, more than half the world's oil production is nationally owned oil companies, not just the household names we tend to think of or see on street corners at gasoline stations. And I think and we did see over the last year some prominent announcements that in some cases companies were sort of pulling back a little bit from some targets or commitments that had been made. I think a key point is that in my view, if inside boardrooms or in companies, one believed with conviction that we would get anywhere close to net zero by 2050, people would be behaving very differently than they are today. And so despite some rhetorical commitments, the actions we're seeing suggest either companies don't believe that we are going to really get to these goals or take them seriously, or that if we do, it's a lot harder to make money, maybe, in that world of clean energy than it is with continued reliance on profits from oil and gas. And some shareholders seem to share that view. Not all, because at least some companies got a bit of a bump for pulling back a little bit from some of the commitments. I think in the long run, that's a bad bet. I think Catherine has been maybe more eloquent than anyone about this and what's coming. Just because this can't continue, in order to believe, and we saw this week with an op-ed from the head of the IEA, Fatih Birol, saying oil, gas, and coal use would peak by the end of the decade. There was a strong response from the head of OPEC to that, which said, no, that's not right. Don't tell everyone that's going to happen. Oil and gas use are going to keep rising. Net zero doesn't mean zero oil and gas. There's still, even in the IEA modeling, there's still oil and gas, but much less than today. You don't take goals like net zero 2050 without a sharp decline, maybe not to zero, in oil use and in gas use. And in order to believe that oil use will remain at current levels for decades to come, you need to believe that, broadly speaking, we'll be okay with failing by large amounts to meet our climate goals. And again, I think other people here, Abby and Catherine, others are pretty eloquent in what that would mean and why the consequences of that are just not acceptable. I mean, I think in the end, the tipping points that we will see not only potentially in climate change, but in social mobilization to do something about it, those, I think, history teaches us. When you look at environmental pollution in the US through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then 1 in 10 Americans came out into the streets together in the first Earth Day in 1970 and said, this has to stop. We can't have air we can't breathe and water we can't drink and lakes our kids can't swim in. Something has to change. And that sort of led to the landmark environmental laws that still guide us today from the early 1970s. The famous American economist Herbert Stein once said, if something cannot continue forever, it will stop. And I sort of feel like that's true for climate. We just don't know how and when and how nonlinear that'll be and how disruptive. But it's why I think a bet on business as usual for decades to come is probably not a good one. And then ultimately, it's important to say to solve climate change, we not only need more leadership from the biggest energy companies, we need broad, structural, systemic change to start making sure that demand starts falling quickly. If oil demand keeps rising and any particular companies decide to pull back and stop investing, one of two things happens. Prices spike, and we know what the political response will be to that when people are running for re-election. Won't allow that to happen, whatever it takes. Or other companies will step in to fill the void. There's no lack of hydrocarbons to produce somewhere else in the world. So we need simultaneously to be doing all of these things and making sure that we are thinking about how to increase social mobilization, thinking about how to make sure we implement the IRA successfully, and then thinking about what comes next after the IRA, whether it's in Washington or in Brussels or in capitals in emerging and developing economies where the biggest growth in emissions is going to come from in decades to come, just to make sure that we transition this entire system, again, with the scale and speed we need, because we're going to hear at COP this year in the stock tank that we are not on track. So we need to move a lot faster.
Jason, if I could distill that for a second, the issue was that the oil companies pledged that they were going to make big investments to go into renewables, or at least some of them did, and go towards net zero, reducing their emissions. But as they've made more money, as oil prices have gone up, they didn't really invest that money into their renewables business, into their zero carbon business.
Yeah, and again, it is.
the crux
You look at the data from the IEA. It's a few percentage points for the industry as a whole. The IEA will, some are higher, 15, 20%. So there's heterogeneity there, but broadly speaking, that is the case. And I think what one would hear is it's hard to make as much money in a lot of those areas of clean energy as it is right now with very high oil and gas prices. And we need to struggle with that reality and change that reality. So yes, need to push for leadership, need to push companies to do more. And one of the best ways to make that happen faster is to change that playing field through policy like the IRA and a host of other ways where there's huge economic opportunities to invest more in the clean energy transition, and shareholders will appreciate that and reward it, not penalize it.
So if they've shown some wavering, I think there's a big question about what we do about this. Abby, I'm going to come to you with this. I want to present a contrast here because I just met with John Kerry yesterday. He's meeting with many oil companies while he's here. He and many others in the administration say you can't solve climate change without the oil and gas companies. Jigar Shah, DOE, always makes the point they're the ones with the access to capital to scale up, to do solutions as quickly as we need. But I want to read this from Derek Brower, this farewell column at the FT. He looks at this from another way, though. Remington was good at typewriters, but not the personal computer. Why expect ExxonMobil or Saudi Aramco to lead or even survive a shift from their core businesses of digging up fossil fuels and selling them? And do you really want them to? So if we need these guys, but I don't know if we can trust them, even if they wanted to be good, Remington's point there. What do we do? How do we manage all that?
So I think we have to have a power analysis. Is there any business that's accountable to shareholders that would ever see the power, political power, as well as raw energy power, and profits that they currently have? Is there any industry that would do that voluntarily? I think we're seeing the answer is no. And so I think you're beautifully teeing up this dilemma, which is how can you take power from such a politically powerful industry that, for instance, in this country, has the ability to manipulate prices to determine an election? How do you take that power when you still need that industry? Even net zero isn't without oil and gas. You have the world dependent still 82 to 86% on fossil fuels. We don't want this to be a transition that leaves people without a basic need. It needs to be orderly. And this is the group of people that, as you say, has the most access to capital and perhaps technology to create the ability to achieve negative emissions. Are they using the R&D capital that the IRA is providing to them to do that? I'll give one example. We've just seen the DOE approve the first big direct air capture projects in Louisiana, one of our fossil fuel hubs, globally important one. And one of the potential beneficiaries, the contract hasn't been worked out, but is Occidental, whose CEO is saying what the world needs is zero carbon oil. So they're going to use a very intensive energy intensive system to extract more oil and burn it and call it, there's actually a funny move she makes, from net zero to zero carbon oil. Like that's probably not a great use of public funds. It's probably not moving us forward to what the IPCC says we need, which is to stop oil and gas extraction, to make a full energy transition, or as full a transition as we possibly can make, and then take more CO2 out of the air. And so we're just, as we're heading into the COP, where the discussion will be about, less about energy transition, but about abating fossil fuels, we are in conversation about how, as a society, as a US society, as a global society, let me pause on US society, we're the biggest oil and gas producer in the world, so it matters what our society thinks about the future of fossil fuels. We're really in a conversation about, can we do it? Can we do what the scientists are telling us we have to do, which is get off fossil fuels to the maximum extent we possibly can? And as that deadline to do it comes, the economic and otherwise disruptive nature of that transition is, I think, suggesting even to some very good faith climate hawks that maybe we can't do it. Maybe we have to buy a very expensive insurance policy in, for example, carbon capture and sequestration at scale. Not to draw down emissions, but to preserve an industry that we're very familiar with. So I'm in the farewell FT letter camp, that I don't think we can trust the oil and gas industry, certainly voluntarily, to just manage this transition on their own. The pressures, and I know lots of people in this industry, they're creative and great, they understand geology and culture and profits. Like, these are creative, amazing people whose minds and energy can be put to good use. But within the system that they are operating under, quarterly profit deadlines, I'm not seeing it. And so I think we need a societal agreement, which I know you can speak to better than anyone. I think we need the kinds of mandates that Minister Goebel is pushing in Canada. Our carrots in the IRA are fantastic. I've lobbied my head off to pass that bill, but it's not enough, and we're going to need a durable and clear signal that this country is getting off fossil fuels so that industry believes it. Because until you believe it, there's no reason to shrink what is a wildly successful profit model right now.
Super quick.
Oh, sure.
And then I'll be quiet because we have brilliant leaders and climate communicators like Catherine here. But just a nuance on what Abby said, one of the challenges, I think, is also different investor bases. At a time of high oil and gas prices, There are some investors out there who want the returns from those high oil prices. And if you're a major energy company and you pivot too far in the direction of moving your investment to clean energy, you might be penalized by the shareholder base. There's another group of shareholders that want to invest in transition. And for many of these companies we're talking about may never be green enough. And there's a tension there, which may make it difficult to the point about Remington or whatever. Can companies do both? At some point, do we need to might we see a split where there's kind of a transition arm and a legacy arm and companies start doing different things? I think we'll see how that plays out in the years to come.
Minister Guilbeault, Abby was talking a lot about a more active role for government, and you're the government guy here.
I'm the government.
On our panel, so you get the next question. Okay. You've also got a giant oil industry in Canada. It's a big part of the cultural fabric and certainly the economic fabric there. So I might want to ask a follow-up on that element, but if we could just get started with this idea of government taking a more active role. Canada, the Trudeau government, has done a lot in the past year and a half. Can you explain the biggest things, probably the 2030 plan, and then especially some of the bigger steps that have happened recently in the past few months?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And thank you so much for having a Canadian politician here on your stage. Our climate action started before I was nominated a year and a half ago. In 2018, we introduced carbon pricing in Canada, and we had to fight all the way to the Supreme Court because we were sued by many of our jurisdictions. We call them provinces and territories in Canada. We won in the Supreme Court. So right now in Canada, carbon pricing is at $65 a ton. It will go up to $170 a ton by 2030. So we know 65 is not enough, and we know it's going to really start to bite when we get around $100 a ton. So we're getting there. It's going up by $15 a year. In the last year and a half, I've adopted clean fuel regulations to ensure that refineries reduce the carbon footprint, and through regulations, the carbon footprint of the fuel and diesel that they sell. We've presented draft regulations for a zero emission vehicle mandate. Draft regulations just before Christmas. Final regulations before COP will be to force car companies to get to 100%. Zero emission vehicle by 2035 in Canada, 60% by 2030. We already have existing methane regulation for the oil and gas sector to reduce methane emissions in that sector by at least 40% by 2025. We want to get to at least 75% reduction of methane emissions in the oil and gas sector by 2030. Draft regulations will be coming before COP. What else? I'm forgetting something. Clean electricity regulations. So we want our electricity sector to be net zero by 2035. Those draft regulations were published earlier this summer. We're the first G20 country to eliminate fossil fuel subsidy, federally supported fossil fuel subsidy. We did that at the beginning of the summer, and we're the only G20 country that has a commitment to also eliminate public financing for fossil fuels. So crown corporations that would offer things like loan guarantees. So they're not direct subsidies according to the WTO definitions, but they're still support for the oil and gas sector. And there's a couple of other things we're doing. So we believe that, so I think I agree with Abigail, like as a legislator, as a regulator, voluntary measures won't get, and Jason as well, voluntary measures won't get us to where we need to go, which is why we're using every possible tool at our disposal. We're also using carrots as well, not as much as in the U.S., but I mean, we're at $200 billion of committed investment in Canada in transit, clean tech, renewables, adaptation to climate change, greener buildings. So it's not the $380 billion of the IRA in the U.S., but we're 10 times smaller. So we like to think that we punch above our weight compared to you guys, if I may. So carrots are important, but we believe that the use of regulatory tools and mechanisms like pricing carbon are very important. But it's challenging. It's a challenging environment right now for the climate change debate, certainly in the U.S. and Canada as well. That debate has got caught into the culture wars, and we're seeing that in other parts of the world as well. I have to stand up in the House of Commons every day to defend carbon pricing, to defend clean fuel regulations, because our equivalent of the Republicans in Canada has made this one of their main targets for the next election. They've lost 2 elections on carbon pricing, so I guess they didn't get the memo. Happy to fight them on a 3rd election on carbon pricing, but we believe that these tools are very important, and it is only by using all of the available tools that we have as lawmakers that we can hope to achieve our Paris commitment targets.
So you alluded to some of the domestic political struggles that you have to deal with in trying to get these programs through, and I think our audience here, I'm sure, in New York, sees this with the American government all the time. There are huge political obstacles to passing anything. But I want to shift and point out that, well, there are international obstacles too. You still have a robust oil industry in Canada, and oftentimes internationally that frustrates other partners that you need to come along to do all these other clean energy things. And so on the 2030 plan, I just want to mention that Canada's National Observer was kind of pulled out some stats from it and pointed out that even though you're doing all these things on clean energy, there's also an expectation that oil production rises. I think 33% by your own projections from 2020 to 2030. And I just want to hear a little bit about how you justify that and how you balance that, or I guess how that complicates the balance with trying to reduce emissions and promote clean energy too.
So our energy regulator recently, at the end of the spring, published a new outlook for energy production in Canada and energy demand, and they looked at 3 scenarios. One, business as usual, which is the 33% that the National Observer is referring to, I believe, and 2, IEA compliant scenarios where we would see oil and gas production peak at around 2027 in Canada and decline depending on which scenarios, but either by 1/3 or 2/3 by 2050. So we are having this conversation about production in Canada. It's very challenging for a federal politician in our federation to go after production of natural resources because it's a provincial jurisdiction as per our constitution. So the tools that I have at my disposal as federal environment and climate change minister is tackling the pollution, the emissions. The Supreme Court was very clear on that. The federal government can do that. So, which is why I can go after methane, which is why I will be tabling regulations to cap the emissions of the oil and gas sector. It's going to be a cap and cut. So I'm saying, regardless of what happens to production of oil and gas in Canada, the emissions will need to go down, and then the companies will have to figure out how they do that. Do they do that through investment in CCS or other forms of technology? What path they want to choose to achieve those emission levels that will be set in law in Canada?
Catherine, I want to come to you. There was I felt a bit of a consensus there over the last 2 answers about the need to have all types of different solutions. So when it comes to continued fossil fuel production in Canada, and even the US, it's in the Inflation Reduction Act, the big climate spending bill from last year, there are a lot of provisions for hydrogen, often fossil fuel based. There are provisions for carbon capture. Of course, there's a ton of money going into wind, solar, batteries, all of that. Can you give us a sense of like which of these things are most effective and the way governments that are taking action, how effective you think it'll be to have this embrace of so many different types of strategies, even those that often include what's ultimately fossil fuel technology?
Yes, I absolutely can. And what I would say is there is no silver bullet. You will see headlines in newspapers saying, is this the next silver bullet? And the answer is always no, it is not. But the good news is there's a lot of silver buckshot. And what that means is we have solutions across the spectrum that together can truly tackle this issue at scale. So let me put some numbers on what everyone said so far. Out of all of our heat trapping gas emissions, about 3/4 of those come from the fossil fuel industry. Over 80% comes from actually burning the coal, gas, and oil, and the rest of it comes from methane leaking from oil wells and coal mines and other extraction processes. So we need solutions across the spectrum that address the ag sector, the land use sector, deforestation, and fossil fuels, because that's 100%. But fossil fuels are 75% of that. So that's why our conversation is focused on this. If you look at direct air capture, which Abby brought up, that's the idea that by passing air through a filter, we can actually suck the carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's amazing. It was originally invented by these two Swiss academics at ETH Zurich, who then created Climeworks, which is a really interesting organization that is at the forefront of direct air capture today. And Climeworks estimates, because I was just with them a little while ago, that if we put everything we could into direct air capture by 2050, it could take up 2.5% of fossil fuel emissions. Everything we have. So, like you said, we need everything, but it is one piece of silver buckshot. It's not even the biggest. Two bigger pieces that we haven't mentioned so far are efficiency and nature. The cheapest form of energy is the energy we don't use, and in the United States, 67% of our energy is wasted. In Canada, we're slightly better, but not that much better.
Working on it.
Yes, exactly. Working on with some of the carrots that you mentioned from carbon pricing. And then what about nature? It turns out carbon is essential to life. We're all carbon-based life forms, but we just have too much of it in the atmosphere, and we need to put it somewhere else. Nature has the ability to take up to a third of our carbon out of the atmosphere over the next decade. That's a really big piece of buckshot, while also addressing concerns like the biodiversity crisis and the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples to manage their own lands. So actually didn't mention any of the work that Canada's doing in that area too, but that is part of the climate portfolio, is investing in nature and investing in people and equity. So we need all of these. So my answer to your question is yes, all of the above. But like you just said, you can't depend on the goodwill of industries who are and have been for decades the most influential and wealthy in the world to do it out of the goodness of their hearts when the quarterly returns are what they're judged on. It just makes no sense. So we need the policy mechanisms. And there are carrots like the IRA that have spurred manufacturing, especially in red states down the middle of the country for batteries and wind and solar. But we also need the policies to set those regulations in place to say, here's a goal, and together we have to achieve that goal. And you know what's really interesting? There is support across almost every country in the G20, widespread support for climate action. When you ask people, should the government be doing what it takes to tackle the climate crisis at scale? Almost 3/4 of people across all G20 countries say yes. So there is the public support, and that is why we need the government policy. We can't depend on companies to do it themselves, but we need every piece of buckshot we have at the table.
Now, I know you all want to talk a little more about the IRA, and so for the audience, let me take a second. I am always surprised at how few people know what the IRA is, so forgive me if you all do, but I just want to be super sure. The Inflation Reduction Act passed about a year ago now by the US Congress, pushed by President Biden. Even though it is called the Inflation Reduction Act, is largely a climate spending bill, depending on how you measure, somewhere between $250 billion and maybe $1 trillion, if you believe estimates from Goldman Sachs, will ultimately be provided by the US government for climate-friendly programs, a lot of them in renewable energy, wind, battery, solar, but as we've been discussing, some of it for fossil fuel technologies as well. We've talked about this silver buckshot idea. You got to do everything. So, Abby, I want to hear your opinion for a second about this climate spending package, and I want to know what you think about how we're balancing those different types of solution in this silver buckshot. Are we putting enough emphasis on the right ones and keeping others at maybe a correctly proportional amount? What do you think about how we're balancing these different options?
Well, let me say the top 3 things that I wish I could wave a magic wand and change. One is that you have to say what the IRA is. Yeah,
I always got to say it.
Because it is a signal accomplishment. I remember watching the Senate vote, and the idea of getting the U.S. Senate to finally pass a climate bill. Thought you might wait your whole life for that. Mm-hmm. And my sister had a baby during it. I was in her labor, and I came back, and they were still voting. So it was an emotional day, but wow. I couldn't stop crying because my feeling was, now we got a chance. Now we have a chance. The second thing I wish people knew is that it's a compromise. I would characterize it beyond all the buckshot, more of an all of the above policy. And that was the political compromise that was necessary. And so from my perch at Earth Justice, where we're often involved in permitting fights on the ground, we're seeing what's getting built. On the one hand, I want everybody to know that this year alone, there are 272 new major clean facilities that will change the US economy, and that's in year one. If you remember what it was like immediately when that act passed, the gloss on it was, oh my God, this requires the government to move quickly with industry to build stuff. We don't know how to do that in the United States anymore. It's going to be a disaster, and we're going to have a Soleandra fight every day. That's not, I'll add that to the wand things I hope never happen. But we are moving. Industry is getting the signal, and things are changing on the ground. The facts are changing on the ground. And so I think there's enormous potential in the industrial strategy if people know about it, understand it, and learn to love it. Heading into an election year, I'll add. So, but on the other hand, we have two areas of the country, very politically powerful, the Gulf South, Louisiana and Texas, and the Ohio River Valley of Appalachia, West Virginia is part of that. And these are regions that do not yet have a vision of what it looks to be post-fossil fuels. And those are places where we are tripling down on a fossil economy. And we can't get there in the US, and we can't get there globally if that's the direction. So in a series of weeks or months, we may see EPA hand over the keys to injection wells in Louisiana, and then Texas, West Virginia would follow. Let's look and see what our hydrogen tax credits end up, but there could be massive subsidies for fossil hydrogen as well as green, hopefully not. But depending on how the IRA is executed, we could see a massive new wave of fossil construction subsidized by taxpayers. And so we have to keep in mind that this is not a self-executing plan. When I listen to you talk, I am amazed at how direct the strategy is. It's regulations about emissions, about carbon. We don't have that in the United States. We have it in some states, really important. We need to have it in more states, and if anyone's seen it, Rhodium just put out a good analysis of how we get to our Paris commitments. The states play an enormous role in that. But we do not have a national energy policy that is directed expressly at carbon. And so what that means is the execution, where the money is channeled from the IRA, is what the end result will be. And it could be a result that's pretty mixed and does as much for fossil fuel companies that are wired to take advantage of these subsidies as it does for the clean folks. I don't believe that future is possible because all of us are going to work to make sure that it won't be. But we gotta keep working at this. And we need, one last point, I'm overdoing it. We need a set of very ambitious climate and energy and health regulations from the Biden administration. They're in a race against time. They need everyone's support to get done standards for oil and gas fields, transportation, heavy duty trucks and cars both. For power plants, we gotta get all that done so that all of this money that's in play is going to the clean stuff, not the dirty.
Minister Gilboa, you wanted to chime in?
If I can reassure you, I said we were sued on carbon pricing in Canada. I'm also sued on our single-use plastic ban by some of our provinces and companies. We are also sued on the reform impact assessment regime, which, God forbid, includes the perspective of Indigenous peoples in impact assessment in Canada now, as well as climate change, because why would we do impact assessment if not for, amongst other things, climate change? I will get sued on the cap on oil and gas emissions, likely get sued on the clean electricity regulation as well. So often when I come back...
But will you win?
Well, we've won on pricing. We're confident we will. And sometimes I was an environmentalist. I guess I still am an environmentalist, but I was in the environmental movement for 25 years. I'd worked at Greenpeace. I'm a co-founder of a large Canadian ENGO. And I like to think of myself as an environmentalist. So when I come back home and my kids ask me how my day went, I'm tempted to say today was a good day. I got sued for what we're trying to do on climate or nature or plastics. And if I haven't got sued, it's perhaps because I didn't work hard enough that day. We have a premier of a province in Canada that for purely ideological reason is blocking $30 billion worth of investment in clean tech and renewables. Thousands of jobs at risk, just like what we're seeing in some of U.S. states. So that battle is still very real, and it's not just in the U.S. It's certainly in Canada and other parts of the world, which is why the work you're doing on communications and climate literacy is so important, and we're trying to change the way we do communications in Canada to include more of this best available science and knowledge in terms of how we communicate with our public about that. Because you're right, there's in that province where all those clean projects have just been stopped by the premier. There's a poll that came out this morning. 69% of people in that province support climate action. Support climate action by the federal government. It's the part of the country where the federal government is the least popular. 69% of the people in there support federal action to put a cap on the emissions of the oil and gas sector. So you're right. There is a lot of public support for what we're trying to do, but there's also lots of political battles that have to be fought.
Jason, I want to come to you to hear some of your thoughts on the U.S. climate program that we're talking about, but I want to frame it a little first in the geopolitical context, and maybe have you talk about not just what's happening in the U.S., but compare it to some of the other climate action agendas that are appearing around the world. And I'll start by referencing a comment that you made on your recent appearance on the Ezra Klein podcast. You were talking about how, in some ways when you talk about the energy transition moving from oil and fossil fuels to renewables, that in many ways it might be more of an addition, where the concept is like oil and other fossil fuels only kind of plateau, and then we just add renewable production on top of it. We're burning more coal around the world than ever before, according to the IEA. I think you'd mentioned that we're still burning as much wood as we were, a century and a half, 2 centuries ago. And so, when the IRA actually happened, it was a compromise measure. Senator Manchin from West Virginia, a big fossil fuel state, wanted to have all these energy security measures as he pitched it, more oil leasing offshore. And this, in part, his rationale was, energy markets were going crazy at the time. Since Russia invaded Ukraine a year and a half ago, prices have gone up for all different types of energy. And so, and that is still an ever-present thing. A lot of countries around the world, not just the U.S., many countries, I think probably of all stripes, are very concerned about energy security, maybe just as much or more so than some of their climate programs. That's kind of what I want to hear you talk about. Like, how much have countries retrenched on their climate programs because of energy security, and how do we see that playing out in the actual climate solutions that they're pushing going forward?
Yeah, we're a couple of weeks away from the 50th anniversary of the Arab oil embargo, and for the last half century, that sort of obsession with dependence on imports, the possible weaponization of oil supply, sort of dominated so much of U.S. and other countries' energy policy. But I think in the last, 10, 15 years, we kind of forgot energy security was a risk. There was maybe a lot of supply. We had the shale revolution in this country. There was more complacency. And obviously that has gone away in the last roughly 2 years. So energy security is front and center again as a major concern of policymakers. I think Minister Guilbeault would agree. As well as, hopefully, for many policymakers, urgent decarbonization. And that's both a risk and an opportunity. Because I think the lesson in the near term, do you need some more LNG supplies to make up for and fill your gas inventories in Europe? Yes. A few coal plants get fired up because you got to make sure you get through a cold winter if the winter's cold. But in the long run, like if we needed any reminder that the best thing you could do, not just for decarbonization, but for your energy security, is to reduce your dependence on globally traded hydrocarbons, inevitably exposed to geopolitical risk. It's what we've seen in Europe in the last 2 years. And I do think it has helped to propel, read Joe Manchin's statement of support for the Inflation Reduction Act. It is also about America's energy security, and we have the US economy and the economic opportunities created by this transition very much front and center now. I think on the IRA, I would just maybe say two things. One is how critically important it is to now implement effectively this very large, very complicated law. Some of that is how do we build clean energy infrastructure faster, or the broad category of so-called permitting reform, but do that in a way which I think Abby thinks about probably almost every day without it's easy to build things if you run over indigenous and tribal concerns, not ignore other ecosystem and biodiversity concerns. So we got to make sure we don't do it that way, and that's hard. We need to do we need to do mining, right? We need critical minerals for this transition. I do want to slight diversion. Sorry to take time, but I just on the mining topic.
It's your show, Jason.
We're
all here for you.
Catherine mentioned efficiency and conservation, and we really shouldn't forget that. And critical minerals is an area where that comes up. Yes, we need more mining for sure, especially if we want to reduce dependence on, say, China, where most of the minerals are refined and processed today. But I was struck, watching, I think it was the US Open or something, you watch TV commercials, which we don't watch that much on streaming anymore. Every other ad was for cars that go 400, 500 miles. Those are big batteries with a lot of minerals in them. We have professors here working on fast charging. You could charge in a couple of minutes instead of 45 minutes or hours. A vast charging network if you could charge really fast, might allow people to feel comfortable with smaller batteries that have fewer minerals but allow you the range and freedom you need. Innovations in electrochemistry that don't require lithium ion but maybe sodium ion and minerals that are more plentiful. Innovations in recycling. We need more minerals, yes, but maybe we can change the shape of the curve and through efficiency and conservation. Implementing the IRA is complicated geopolitically, right? So provisions in that have sparked trade concerns, not just in Europe, but other parts of the world. I'm spending a lot of time this week at Climate Week with leaders from emerging and developing economies who don't have the money that the US or Europe has. You're throwing all of this money at supporting investment in clean energy. What about us? You're stealing investment from us. Maybe that hydrogen project would have come here. How do they respond? And how do we make sure we don't get into a downward spiral of tit-for-tat retaliation, but we kind of work together because we need more cooperation, especially at a time of great power rivalry, where if we depend on China for all the cheap solar panels and batteries and electric vehicles, that raises other economic and security concerns. And then I think it's, this, as Abby said, this is a historic achievement, major area of focus for the advocacy and policy community. And now we got to think about what comes next. And for me, what has to come next is the IRA was a historic achievement to address emissions, not fully, but in a major way, for 12% of the world's emissions. And we need to do much more in foreign policy and climate policy and international economic policy to dramatically accelerate the pace of capital deployment into clean energy, particularly in emerging and developing economies. That's going to be front and center at COP. It's a major need. We have Andrew Kamau here from the Energy Center. I know we have a couple minutes at the end for questions. Maybe he can offer a thought, who helped lead the Kenyan Energy Ministry and leads our Energy Opportunity Lab here. It's a big priority for what we're trying to do at the Energy Center here at Columbia.
Before we go to audience questions, I want to fit in two last questions. But I will beg you, just because Minister Gilbo and Catherine, I want to hear from you on a couple things, but I want to get you both in. So I hate to force you to just be concise, but please. Minister Gilbo.
You're asking a politician not to talk too much.
That's why I am begging.
Scary.
I don't think I'd have success any other way. So, but yes, I want you to give us the cross-border view about what Jason was talking about on the geopolitical issues, especially because right now you and so many, thousands, at least hundreds, if not thousands of diplomats are in New York from all over the world to talk about, among other things, the climate change problem. How has the way the U.S. has done its climate program changed what Canada wants to do, change what other countries are doing, and how much friction has it created, especially in diplomatic talks like what's going on right now about the influence that the U.S. is having this way?
Well, I think Jason touched on some of the challenges we're seeing with the implementation of IRA, but IRA was also viewed by many around the world as a game changer. I mean, I can't communicate to you because it's a secret, but the cabinet conversation we had when IRA came up and we all sat around the cabinet table and we went, holy moly, like, and I'm sure the Europeans were having the same type of conversation, and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Indians. So there is tensions, obviously, that have been created for all sorts of reasons, and I think unforeseen consequences of IRA perhaps. But there's also lots of positive things that IRA is contributing on the international debate on climate change. I mean, the climate change negotiations are complex. They're difficult. They're challenging. We saw that very little progress was achieved at the G20 in New Delhi a few weeks ago. The G7, on the other hand, in Japan, was able to make progress on a number of things, including renewables, phase out of unabated fossil fuels. It's the first time we have an international agreement where this is agreed upon. We've never had that before. We've had conversation about it, but but we also, I mean, we've proven in Montreal at COP15 on the Nature COP that we can get together as a concerted nation and tackle some really complex and difficult issues. And then we came to New York for the High Seas Treaty, which was 30 years in the making. Well, we had an agreement in Montreal, and a few months later, we have an agreement in New York on high seas protection. So we can still do these things, and often, because climate change it's become so loaded with so many different issues and challenges, we lose sight of the fact that we can still do these things. We have this ability, even if it's challenging, even if it's complicated.
Catherine, I hate to do this, but you're going to get about 60 seconds for this answer, so I'm really sorry.
That's okay.
But,
This morning, the Weather Channel called me a soundbite machine. So let's see if that actually is true.
You are well suited for this then. It's a little bit of a curveball, still on the topic of the Inflation Reduction Act, but tying in some of what you said before. Like, we've been talking a lot about policy, diplomats, abstract stuff, and I want to talk about people for a second. You know, we were speaking about like how frequently it is that people just don't know that this giant climate bill was passed. I was out, I'll give you a preview of my upcoming reporting if you want to check it out in the Washington Post. I was out in Las Vegas for a story along these lines. And I will tell you the first striking thing is people, maybe it's Vegas, it's so hot, they're worried about Lake Mead and how low it is, but people of all political stripes there, very quick to say climate change is happening, we see it every day, we know something is wrong. But across the board also have no idea, very little idea that this bill was passed. Republicans don't know, but even, I spoke with a Democrat, a big Bernie Sanders person who really wants Washington to do something about climate change. She said that she thought the Inflation Reduction Act was about raising interest rates, right? So what, and this is common, like it's hard to believe, but like everybody I talked to had some story like this. And this person is somebody who she said she talks politics every day for her job, but still did not know. So, you understand the difficulties of communicating on the science issue. Like what is going on with people, just broadly, and like what they're hearing, what they're being told, and how big of a problem is this?
So we are
60 seconds, please. Sorry.
We're here. We need to be there. Think of it as a row of dominoes, each one of which is a different solution. And we've been knocking over an individual domino at a time. What's the first domino in the chain? Communication. If people don't understand why it matters, why would they care? If they don't know what to do with it, about it, why would they support action? So we need communication not only about what is happening here and now, not the polar bears, not the ice sheets, my home, my family, my job, and that's only half the coin. The other half of the coin is we need communication on what the solutions look like and how they benefit you here and now, your family, the place where we live. And I do not see any governments stepping up to the plate on the type of communication that is needed to build the political will to really turn this around. The worry is there, the concern is there, the awareness is there, but the knowledge and support for solutions isn't. And I know from communication science, we can fix it.
You're very good at that. So we do want to shift to some audience Q&A at this point. If you're joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, I think we have a mic that's floating around, so hands raised. I just saw this gentleman go first.
Hi, thanks so much, everybody, for this afternoon's talk. Quick question for the panel. When you think about government regulation in terms of maybe less carrots and more sticks, what are some policies that can be implemented that cannot easily be rolled back in the next administration?
Excellent question.
That's a very good question.
Catherine, you want to go first? I feel like you deserve more time, please.
Well, yeah, but that's not. I'm a climate scientist.
Okay.
I would just say yes. That is the $1 trillion question. I want to know the answer.
I would say quickly, first of all, more sticks and more carrots. And speaking for the U.S., there are many laws that have big support. If you'd asked me if the Clean Water Act would have been gutted as it just was last term, I would have said, I hope not, because it'll be politically unpopular. So I'm not going to take politically popular bedrock laws to the bank. We have now a doctrine that the Supreme Court has kind of invented and now applied several times, which is that if anything the president does has significant consequences in the eyes of the court, they will go back and see whether Congress specifically allowed for that particular action. Our laws were passed in the 1970s, and the premise of modern government is that you put a big directional requirement out there and experts implement it. So your question is the gigantic question now in the United States. And I think the political pressure on the court to deal with what is happening to us in our homes, in our workplaces right now in climate change is going to increase. And either the court is going to have to change or people are going to have to moderate their views, because we have many laws in the books that drive scientific and health-based requirements where the science is there, the facts are there, and the mandate to government is clearly there, and taking action should be within laws that we've understood well over many years.
This is something we as a government struggle with every day, and not just we in Canada or in the US, but as we're witnessing a rise in populism amongst democracies around the world, many of us are trying to think of ways where we can, a democratically elected government has the mandate of the people to do what they feel is right. And so it's always a bit of a challenge. We are using certain mechanism in Canada, for example, on carbon pricing. We're using this mechanism called contracts for differences, where we're signing contracts with companies where we're locking in carbon pricing for billions and billions of dollars with companies over time, so all the way to 2040 and maybe even beyond. So in theory, the government, a new government elected that doesn't believe in climate change could come back and say, we want to be rid of this. They could do it, but they would have like billions of dollars on their books the first year. So it's not impossible for them to do it, but it's a serious disincentive to do that. And we're trying to think of other mechanisms like that we can use to try and lock in as much as possible these type of mechanisms.
I'm not going to take time to answer that except to refer people or put in a plug for the weekly podcast we have. The next episode drops in 2 hours, and it's this week with Brian Deese, the head of the former head of the National Economic Council and architect of the IRA, and he just released with some partners something called the Clean Investment Monitor. We're actually tracking where clean energy investment is happening, a lot of red states, and we talk about that question, so maybe people can check it out.
You've all been such a wonderful audience, and I'm delighted to see so many people here, but I want to give a shout out to the people way in the back corner
Yes.
who've joined us with an obstructed view. Is there anyone back there, any of you wonderful people who wants to take a question? I feel like one of you deserves it most if there's anybody back there.
Good call.
It looks like there is, but I can't see.
There is.
Please tell us your name, because I'll never know what
You're going to see me now. I'll come over here. Thank you. Great discussion. It seems clear, a lot of folks talked about carbon pricing. It seems that in the world's largest economy, there's a clear need and imperative for carbon pricing, but it's clearly not on the agenda right now in Washington. So how do we get it back on the agenda? maybe there's some insights from Canada about what went into civil society mobilization, advocacy, policy development, or communications to bring it back onto the agenda, because it doesn't seem like the trajectory we're on right now, even post-IRA, is going in the direction of carbon pricing, even though it seems that we need to really change that.
Not a
Do you want to
US
offer
expert.
thoughts from the Canadian expert?
I mean, Catherine would say that none of our countries passed a test of climate communications, but we try hard in Canada. And I think we made a commitment during the 2015 election that we were going to do that. And we tried to put it in very layman's term as much as possible. It was about putting a price on pollution. So my stepdad in my hometown of Latsuk, you have to really look it up on a map to be able to find it, worked at the pulp and paper mill all his life, doesn't understand a whole lot about climate change, but he understands that pollution is bad, and not letting pollution be free is a good thing, is rather a good thing, and that big polluters should pay. And that's really how we've tried to bring it forward. But as I said, there's pushback. I mean, we've fought 3 federal elections on this. We will likely fight a 4th one. So it's not. We have it, but it's certainly not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination. I think there's one of the things we're doing, I think, which is also helping in Canada. We recycle 90% of the revenues directly back to households. And we're and people are receiving quarterly payments in their bank account. Federal government, we're working with banks to make sure that it says climate incentive payment. So that people understand that we're helping them in this transition towards lower economy future. And it's not just, we're not imposing this upon them, but we're helping them through that journey. This is also, I think, one of the reasons that mechanism has been more successful in Canada.
And I would add on that note, where does the idea of carbon pricing come from? It comes from pretty much every economist in the world who agrees that in a capitalist market, that's the most effective mechanism to drive down carbon emissions. And today, there is a price on carbon on about 25% of our carbon emissions around the world in over 70 jurisdictions. And in Canada, it was rolled out in several provinces first before it became a federal policy. And I just wanted to highlight 2 very important points that you made that were excellent communication. And number 1 is, not you personally, but in terms of the government, pollution. Everybody understands pollution is bad. So rather than getting into the mechanics of greenhouse gases, it is pollution. And we're going to make polluters pay. That's a message that people can understand that resonates with them. And then the other reason why carbon pricing is so effective is because it reinvests, especially in low to middle income households, so they are not the ones being penalized. That the price signal actually goes where you intend it to go, and instead you can use those funds to support those households and to invest in efficiency and public transportation and other things that help people have a better life as well. So what needs to be done, in my opinion, with both the IRA and with carbon pricing, with all of our solutions, is people are awake. People understand the risks today. People's levels of worry over this and awareness of the problem and the risk are skyrocketing. Now is the time to step up and say, we have solutions and this is what they look like. Did you know there's actually legislation that's already been enacted and it's investing in this and that and accomplishing this and that? Here's how you can make a difference. Here's what more remains to be done, but here's how far we've already come. We can do this. And that's the message that we need today.
Before we wrap up, is there a question from one of the Zoomers who've joined us that we want to take? The truly most obstructed
Yes, I can
view
actually
of all?
pick one and read one. So one of the questions is, how do you address the issue of high gas prices at the pump being a threat to getting elected or reelected?
Oh, that sounds like a Minister Gilbo.
That's a very good question. In fact, one of the measures we've implemented, what I have implemented, the clean fuel regulations, has resulted in one area of the country in 3 to 6 cents increase in the liter of gasoline. We use liters in Canada. I can never remember the conversion to gallons, but
Can we?
Just under 4.
just under 4.
Catherine,
So it's creating a huge debate in that part of the country, and I'm under attack even by some of my own colleagues in my party saying, "Minister, do something about this." So it's challenging, but I mean that's what those tools are designed to do, to make fossil fuels more expensive. I mean, that carbon pricing, clean fuel regulations, it's inevitable. And I think our role as governments and policymakers is, as I said earlier, to make to help people in this transition as much as we can. And that's how we make it more politically palatable. But it is controversial and it is politically challenging. It would be so easy for my Prime Minister Trudeau, to say, listen, Stephen, lots of headwinds, a bunch of premiers fighting you publicly, going against what you're doing. Why don't you, step off the gas or the electric pedal a little bit? But we're not doing that because if there was ever a reminder of why we need to act on climate change, the summer we've just had in Canada with record level forest fires, people in many of our cities couldn't breathe. I mean, Ottawa is just like Washington. Most of the time, it's purest air as you can think. At the end of middle of June, the air quality in Ottawa was worse than it is in Delhi or Calcutta in India because of the forest fires. It came all the way down to here in New York. So I think it's also important for us to remind people of the cost of climate change, of the impacts of climate change. Tens of thousands of Canadians were displaced this summer because of forest fires. Some people died because of forest fires, and we've had hurricanes, tropical storms like we've never seen before. We've had floodings like we've never seen before. So I think Catherine is right. Like, people are seeing it, people are getting it, and it's our responsibility as government to give them the tools and to show them how we can do this.
Jason, if I could have you see us out on that, but I'm going to put the same 60-second limit that I put on Catherine on you, and I just want to put my own little twist on this question. We saw oil prices in recent days, crude hitting $95 a barrel for the first time. Over the past couple of years, Biden's poll numbers have been seemingly really tied to retail gasoline prices. How do you see this as the biggest risk to climate policy in the U.S. going forward?
I don't think it's the biggest risk to climate policy, but rising gasoline prices are a very significant political and economic concern. That was my experience when I had the privilege to serve in the Obama White House, and it will surely be a concern I'm sure, for this administration going into an election year. The truth is, in the near term, there's not a lot, there are a few tools in the toolbox. We have a strategic stockpile of oil, we've used about half of it, so it's a much smaller tool than it was before. You say, what could make a difference in gasoline prices in the very near term? The biggest tool out there is still the fact that the members of OPEC, particularly Saudi Arabia, have a couple of million barrels a day of oil that they could put on the market very quickly, so-called spare capacity. And that is a reminder that, notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. is on a net basis barely importing any oil at all anymore, that doesn't make us energy independent. You're still connected to a global market, and the thing that makes you more secure is reducing your dependence on oil in the first place, not producing more or importing less. The problem is reducing that dependence takes time. It's not something you do when gasoline prices surge and you're worried about next month's or 6 months from now election. So we say that, and then we get super concerned about it, and then the crisis of the moment passes, gasoline prices come down, and we lose focus, and we forget to stay the course in reducing our dependence on oil in the first place, which is what we need to do for climate, and also what we need to do for our own economic security. So I think that's the lesson. There are some near-term things, but actually not a huge number. And really the thing that'll make us most secure and reduce our vulnerability to gasoline price volatility may not be what you do immediately, but it's going to help you in the next, inevitably there'll be another gasoline price spike. It's going to happen again and again. We want to stay the course to make sure that we're more resilient next time.
Well, thank you all for joining us. all of you, especially, I have mad respect for all of you sticking with us for an extra few minutes to finish up here. I do want to remind everyone that the full video recording of this event is going to be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. I'm going to learn the name of the center to invite you to do this at some point. I don't know when. Maybe after I check out the video on the website. So please consider joining us for the next CGEP event. It's called The Politics and Geopolitics of Latin America's Energy Transition. It's taking place tomorrow at 6 p.m. And a full list of upcoming events can be found on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you once again for joining us.